Let's go over the top 5 decks in Clash Royale for November of 2022. Now, let's be honest, this video will have a lot of monks and a lot of phoenixes. Not much I can do about that, I'm sorry. So let's get right into it. Number 1, Monk Graveyard Cycle. Now this is sort of the new variation of Graveyard with the Monk, the Phoenix, as well as control cards like the Zappies. Like most Graveyard decks, this is an extremely control-based deck, meaning that your whole goal is playing pretty passively, building up positive elixir traits on defense, and then turning that into an offensive counter push. Starting out the match, I'm usually pretty passive. I will cycle a Tombstone or my Goblins, but aside from that, I'm really waiting for my opponent to make that first big commitment. This is because the defense of this deck is so strong. This deck has very effective ways of stalling the opponent's pushes. The Tombstone Skeletons, as well as the Zappy Stun, will be able to slow down pushes while your other defensive units deal damage. Monk and Phoenix will be your 2 main defensive mini-tanks, and then your defensive spells and goblins should be able to finish the rest of the opponent's push off. This is generally a pretty fail-safe defensive deck. As long as you don't overcommit on offense, you'll be able to defend almost any type of offensive push. And hey, if you're smart about it, you can even be predictive with the Monk's ability to try to predict your opponent's spells. That being said, cards such as the Monk, Zappies, and Phoenix will often survive a defense, and from those, you will begin to transition into the offense of this deck. One option, like I mentioned previously, is where you have a surviving counter push, and you go ahead and just use that push to tank for the graveyard. Monks and Phoenixes are both extremely effective as a graveyard tank, the Phoenix especially so, because the Phoenix can initially tank for the graveyard, and then once the Phoenix dies, the graveyard can actually tank for the Phoenix. You can also apply extreme bridge pressure if the opponent spends a lot of elixir in the back. Pushes such as a Barbarrel Graveyard or even a Phoenix Graveyard at the bridge are totally justified if the opponent is low on elixir and you're confident that they don't have the counters to a graveyard. All in all, an extremely solid and control-based deck. When played correctly, you're able to control the entire flow of your Clash Royale matches. Number 2, Royal Giant. Now here we go, another Royal Giant deck with the Monk and the Phoenix. I think you're beginning to notice a pattern here. Now this deck is a moderately heavy Royal Giant deck, and it's sort of a combination between a control deck and a beatdown deck. So in some sense, you're going to really want to just react to your opponent's overcommitments, and on the other side, you're also trying to build up these massive Royal Giant pushes to overwhelm your opponent's defenses. Starting up the match, I'm generally pretty passive. Maybe I'll cycle a log or some goblins, but aside from that, I really want to be playing my cards in reaction to my opponents. When doing so, the Monk and the Phoenix are generally pretty good cards to cycle in the back. This is just because your opponent can't really use their spells on them, or else the Monk will just deflect the spells or the Phoenix will just respawn. And the defense of this deck is also quite solid. Again, the Monk and the Phoenix are sort of your mini tanks, and then your Hunter and your Goblins will be dealing most of your damage. In addition, you can use the Fisherman effectively to pull any sort of large building targeting unit, and even get some King Tower activations if you know the placements. When it comes to the offense of this deck, you generally have 2 options. The first is going in with a Royal Giant at the bridge. This is usually what you'll do if you have a surviving counter push. Say you have a surviving Monk or a surviving Hunter, just go in with a Royal Giant in front and put some immediate pressure onto your opponents. The second option is to build up a beatdown style push with a Royal Giant in the back. The goal of this is twofold. You're trying to build up a massive push by the time the Royal Giant reaches the bridge. And secondly, you'll be able to cycle to a second Royal Giant potentially in the opposite lane. This is generally the option that you'll take against cheaper cycle decks, which sort of struggle to defend massive beatdown style pushes. Never forget to use your spells as well as your Fisherman on offense. Without the Fisherman, I don't think Royal Giant would honestly be meta at all. So make sure that you use that Fisherman to pull away any of the opponent's Royal Giant counters. Number 3, Skeleton King Mortar Bait. Now, despite a recent nerf to the Mortar, this Skeleton King Mortar Bait deck is still extremely effective in this meta, now with the Phoenix. This deck is a fast chip style deck, so the whole goal of this match is you're trying to get chip damage over and over throughout the duration of the match. Starting off, I'm generally going to be a little aggressive. I like to cycle cards at the beginning of the match, force my opponents to immediately respond so that I'm going to be on the offensive side of the game. After that, it's all about finding this balance between applying a lot of offensive pressure so that the opponent is always defending, and, well, just not overcommitting and letting your opponents build up a massive push. It's honestly pretty simple. You're really just sending in a miner with some goblins or maybe a mortar on offense, and then playing the Skeleton King to absorb all of the souls of your swarm units so that he can charge up his ability. On the defensive side is where things can get a little bit sketchy, but even then this deck is still very well equipped to defend any type of push. Mortar is there as a building to pull any sort of building targeting units. Aside from that, this is a very bait style defense, right? You have so many swarm units that you're trying to bait out your opponent's swarm counters so that you can use all of your other bait cards. Skeleton Army, Goblin Gang, and the Skeleton King synergize extremely well together, right? You can first play down the Skeleton Army, and then once it dies, you'll charge up the Skeleton King's ability, and then you can just spawn another Skeleton Army all over again. This swarm, plus the high damage output of the Phoenix and the Dark Goblin, makes this deck extremely effective on defense, and will oftentimes leave you with small swarm units surviving that will either chip away at the opponent's tower or will provide you with a basis to form another small counter push. Number 4, Miner Control. Now this deck makes Clash Royale as easy as possible. The win conditions and the defensive options of this deck are super straightforward. This is another chip style deck, so starting things off, I'm always going to be cycling my cards, trying to get chip damage and applying small amounts of pressure onto my opponent. Most of your damage will come from your miners, poisons, and your goblin chip damage, and adding a monk or a phoenix onto your offensive push will make it just that much more effective. As with many of the previous decks, monk and phoenix have such a good synergy together. One useful trick that you may use quite a bit in this deck is to actually use the phoenix to tank for the monk, and then as soon as the phoenix dies, popping the monk ability. This means that after the phoenix dies, the tower will target onto the monk, and because the monk has an ability, the opponent won't be able to use any spells to take out the phoenix egg. Anyways, offensive pushes aside, the defense of this deck is where things can get a little bit sketchy because after all, you are running a quick cycle deck. You have the bomb tower, which is such an effective building. It can take care of any sort of swarm based push and serves as an extremely tanky building for any building targeting units. While this is going, you have the monk or the miner to tank, Goblin Gang to distract any single targeting units, and then you have your Phoenix as sort of your main damage output. This deck is so solid, and for the cheap cost, it's surprisingly easy to pick up and play. And especially once you get towards double and triple elixir time, once you get that monk down for a 3-card cycle, you can constantly be sending in miners, going in with poisons on the tower to slowly but surely chip away at the opponent's tower. Number 5, Golem Beatdown. Finally, Golem is back in the meta, this time running a Phoenix. Now this is about as traditional of a beatdown deck as you can get. In single elixir time, you're trying to build up as much of an elixir advantage as possible, and then use that elixir advantage to build up a gigantic Golem push. So to build up this elixir advantage, what are you going to do? Well, of course, you're going to use your elixir collectors. In single elixir time, your focus should be defending and building up as many collectors as you can, and in double and triple elixir time is when you will try to build your offensive pushes. That being said, there are exceptions to the rule. You know, if the opponent plays a big commitment in the back, then feel free to just mirror that placement with your Golem. But the general goal is pretty straightforward. The offensive push of this deck is also pretty easy to do, right? Golem goes in front, all of your other units go behind. Honestly, not too much I can explain here, other than a quick reminder to use your tornadoes on offense to tornado in any sort of range counters the opponents have. The trickiest part of any beatdown deck is actually gaining the required elixir advantage to go in with a Golem at the proper timing. Like I said, you're always trying to build up a pump advantage. Going in with elixir collectors does two things. It can either give you an elixir advantage, or it can force out a spell from your opponent. But another way you can gain elixir advantage is by trading tower damage. This is an extremely important concept that you have to grasp when you're playing a beatdown deck. Sometimes you're going to have to take a bit of tower damage to deal more damage yourself. If you're building up a bit of a Golem push and your opponent pressures the opposite lane, try to defend with as minimal elixir as you possibly can, because as long as the opponent doesn't take your tower, you're going to have a gigantic Golem push going down the opposite lane. Lastly, the defense of this deck is pretty straightforward. You have your mini tanks in the Dark Prince and the Lumberjack, and then you have your Electro Dragon and your Phoenix that will deal most of your damage in the air. All in all, pretty simple deck to play. Just try to build up an elixir advantage to create these gigantic Golem beatdown pushes.